Hi everybody, welcome back. People in the room, people online. So this will be our fifth and final panel, Decolonial and Abolition Spaces. We'll have three presenters. Please help me welcome Rita Gale, our first presenter. Rita Gale is a PhD researcher at the Department of Geography, University of Birmingham. Her thesis study, The Collective Utopia, Black British Feminists' Creative Escape from the Margins of Society, explores millennial Black feminists in Britain who are presently working collectively as a strategy to counteract their exclusion from the creative and cultural industries. Welcome, Rita.
Thank you. It's good to be in California. Okay, so the paper I'm going to present is something that's been recently published or about to be published. So I'm going to sort of talk through that. But I think before I do, I should preface it with some themes so you have a sense of what the paper is relating to. So up here is the live feed for a UK government website. Of course, it's talking about Corona situation, but also more importantly, it's the website main page for the UK government to inform us that the UK has actually left the European Union. And so I just thought I'd put it up there because it's a theme within the paper I'm presenting. So there are three elements that I want to do as a preface before I go into the paper itself. Three terms. The first term is austerity. So austerity is a term that's used to describe a series of fiscal policies implemented in 2010 by the UK government led by David Cameron in response to the economic downturn of 2008. The policies included massive reductions in government spending, impacting state provision of public services. The effects, which disproportionately have impacted the lives of lower income communities, can be seen up to the present day. Second term is Brexit. Brexit describes the United Kingdom's 2016 referendum result to cease to be a member of the European Union after 43 years of membership. Now, the paper itself was developed as part of, as a sort of fall-off from an event I participated in that was held at the Midlands Arts Centre in Birmingham, England, in February 2019, called The Urban Roots of Creative Black Culture, Gender, Music, and the Body. It was a public event organized by Dr. Patricia Notzolo at the University of Birmingham, and it brought together an international team of African Caribbean researchers to think about gender, the city, and creativity in African and Caribbean culture. In attendance were Connie Bell, who is a theatre practitioner, therapist, and educator, academics, Margaret Byron and Tia Monique Uzo, respectively. And the keynote speaker was Professor Carolyn Cooper of the University of West Indies at Mona, Jamaica. The event led to a themed intervention series which was published in February 2020, last month, in the Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers Journal. So that's the background to the paper. Okay. So it covers three themes. So in the introduction, the recent past can offer us some clues as to the future arenas of Black struggle in Britain. My own research is concerned with the phenomenon of Black British, and I use British in brackets, as many of the women, they reside in Britain, but they may not be British by nationality. So Black British feminist millennials pleasantly working collectively as a means to overcome their exclusion within the creative and cultural industries during this period of austerity and Brexit. And I'll be exploring why the politics of race and gender may likely impact the future of urban roots of creative Black cultures located in Britain. And so the argument here considers the cultural production made by these creative collective case studies informing my research. And they're online. Some of them include names such as Afrofutures UK, BBFA, Black Ballad, Black Girl Fest, Black Live Averts, Galdem, Armel, and Project X. As Gail Lewis reminds us, Black feminism in Britain was formed through the lens of colonialism, post-colonialism, and the competing ways in which the presence of the Black woman in Britain is rendered both visible and invisible. The Black woman in Britain must contest exclusion and erasure at all times. Presently, these millennial creative collectives are exploring approaches to combating their exclusion and erasure using a combination of online and offline practices, which can be summarized as forms of events, media launches, festivals, workshops, and social media posts, etc. Such events are an experimental exploration contesting the formations of Black culture and reflect Stuart Hall's critique of this Black in popular culture. The collectives, through their orchestration of events, are a feature of millennial generation activism, according to veteran activist Tariq Ali, who described the digital era protest movements as episodic activism. The episodic nature of more recent feminist activism in Britain is a reflection of what Michelle Kimpson calls DIY feminism, which serves the need for distinct feminist agendas at specific times and at specific places that are equipped to address the feminist issues particular to those contexts. These creative collectives are formed in the digital age against an historical context of colonialism, post-colonialism, but they refuse to be defined or contained by their past when there is a strong possibility of change in austerity and Brexit times. The agendas explored by these collectives are transnational, translingual, and transgender in form. A retweet on queer identities in America, Brazil, Jamaica, or Kenya can provide a framework for discourses on post-colonialism and migration, but it could just as easily be a conversation about Black people falling in love, because finding love is an important strand in race and gender discourses. In the present, in the age of austerity, Patricia Noxolo contests that making art and being creative in the urban environment must be undertaken as a part of decolonial praxis. These creative collectives have formed in the hostile environment, a situation positioning the Black woman on the front line of austerity and state violence that is informed by the ideologies of Brexit. One feature of Black feminist resistance in Britain is music. Music and its popularized format, the song, continues to fill Black spaces and inspire moments which speak to Black women's exclusion and erasure. Lisa Palmer's writings on lovers rock, the Black British reggae music genre emerging in the 1970s, draws parallels with today's socio-political era. In her revision, Palmer suggests that lovers rock is often wrongly described as a soft, feminized reggae, when in fact lovers rock was an integral part of a much broader and political expression of love and rebellion amongst Caribbean Black British communities in post-industrial Britain. 40 years later, the creative collectives are making events in the spirit of lovers rock to blast out the hate of austerity and Brexit. The 1970s tracks featuring the uplifting vocals of Janet Kay, Carol Thompson, and Karen Wheeler are substituted today by the digital downloads of the millennial musicians who could be considered the new lovers rockers. Artists such as Laura Mbula, Neo, Ray Black, and Lil Sims, regardless of the genre, have provided a shorthand communication tool for Black identities in Britain, which form an embodied space of transnational sensibility. Blackness as song, like blackness as people, moves across fabricated borders, carried by cultural and physical maneuvers lying beyond the reach of appropriation. The movement is in conflict with Britain's efforts to restrain Black culture, seemingly for the purpose of being rejected by the nation at a future date that will be determined by socio-political events. So to the future. Ironically, perhaps, the future of Black culture in the United Kingdom must include a consideration of the Black British archives. The presence of the archives and the politics of collection, curation, and exhibition speak to the ongoing discourses of Black exclusion and erasure in the United Kingdom. In offering a personal account of their struggle to save the archive of the Lambeth Women's Project, which was an activist group based in South London in the UK, Burin and Sawinski speak to the urgency Black British cultures face to safeguard recent cultural histories. They draw on their own archival archivist working experiences and conclude that Black narratives can continue to resist the threat of exclusion and erasure by the method of document and record as we go, using this as a means to navigate the gap that exists in regards to research and academic literature in the UK. The urgency becomes greater still as solutions are sought to meet the demands of archiving current and digital Black British cultural production. The archive helps to situate new and revised conversations on the histories of Britain as the nation attempts to take stock of Brexit, and internal debates on how it should proceed to restart relationships with nations and regions in the 21st century that were once part of the British colonial empire. The article finds itself back to colonialism, post-colonialism, not for the purpose of going back into history, but to move forward through reconciliation of Black histories in Britain. McKittrick presents a methodology useful for this form of reconciliation in her use of decolonial inventory, a series of practice methods as a means to honor Black past while forging Black futures of a good life in the city. McKittrick's methodology forms part of an extended text on themes of plantation futures, a term which could also describe the creative interventions currently being made by these creative collectives located across Britain's urban centres, which include Birmingham, Glasgow, London, Liverpool, and Sheffield, and elsewhere. These collectives work against the political backdrop of urban renaissance, where we have public-private funded strategic planning partnerships encroaching and erasing established sites of 19th century and 20th century Black settlements in Britain as gentrification reclaims former discarded territories. Through an interrogation of the creative collective inventions, my own doctoral research will present an experimentation through discussion on the changing formations of Black cultures gathered across Britain. Such a discussion remains a necessity, a continuation of community critique, which reconciles the violent humming of colonialism, post-colonialism, still audible today, with a greater expectation of a better life for Black life in Britain. And in closing, the future articulations of Black British culture will expand through the prism of transnational, translingual, and the transgender. Musicology could lead to the translating of identities to come. The 70s lovers rockers deciphered the nation's evolution from post-industrial to neoliberal from their vantage point as Black British women. The present-day new lovers rockers, and Vula, Neo, Black, Sims et al. Are continuing this tradition through their insightful and heartfelt dissemination of life in the current hostile environment of austerity and Brexit. This knowledge passed down to them by the Black British archives has enabled these millennial Black British feminists a moment to amplify their existence beyond the past and present towards the goal of living a good life in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to bring this right up in just a second.
Thank you so much. That was Rita. So our next panelist, Courtney Morris. Courtney Desiree Morris is a visual and conceptual artist and assistant professor of gender and women's studies at the University of California, Berkeley. She teaches courses on critical race theory, feminist theory, Black social movements in the Americas, women's social movements in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as on race and the environmental politics of the African diaspora. She is a social anthropologist and is currently completing a book titled To Defend This Sunrise, Black Women's Activism and the Geographic of Race in Nicaragua, which examines how Black women activists have resisted historical and contemporary patterns of racialized state violence, economic exclusion, territorial dispossession, and political repression from the 19th century to the present. So, she's currently developing a new project on the racial politics of energy production and dispossession of the U.S. Gulf South and South Africa. Her work has been published in American Anthropologist, the Bulletin of Latin American Research, the Journal of Gender and Women's Studies, Gender, Women, and Family of Color, Makeshift, Feminisms in Motion, and Asterisk. Please help me welcome Courtney.
Thank you for that introduction. So I'm going to be sharing a piece today that comes from the book that I am so close to finishing about Black women's activism and their responses to authoritarian state violence in Nicaragua that's happening right now. And so I'm going to try to condense it a little bit, and when I'm reaching time, I'm sure Jovan will let me know. So this piece is called Black Women's Activism in Dangerous Times. On March 8, 2017, while the rest of the world was celebrating International Women's Day, the Nicaraguan national newspaper La Prensa reported that Lottie Cunningham, a well-known indigenous human rights attorney and activist in the North Caribbean Coast Autonomous Region, had received death threats warning her to stop criticizing the Sandinista National Liberation Front. The threat was sent to her via Facebook Messenger from a man who identified himself as Nazi Geri. The letter began ominously, "This is not a courtesy call, but a warning." He then continued, "If you want war, war is what you'll get. War means blood." Over the last decade, Black and indigenous communities living along the Caribbean coastal regions of Nicaragua have lived under what one journalist termed, quote, "a reign of terror," end quote, as they've struggled to hold on to their communal lands while mestizo colonos, or settlers, from the Central and Pacific region seized control of their territories. Between 2008 and 2013, more than 1,000 mestizo settlers have occupied more than 59,000 square kilometers of communal indigenous lands in the region with no response from the state. These settlers have engaged in a series of crimes, ranging from illegal lumber trafficking to intimidating, harassing, and in the most extreme cases, murdering indigenous community leaders and residents who have resisted these encroachments onto their ancestral lands. This occupation campaign has claimed the lives of more than 30 indigenous community members and local leaders, displaced approximately 3,000 Miskito residents, left countless more wounded, and led to the disappearance of community members whose mutilated corpses have often been left as warnings to their families and neighbors. Since returning to power in 2007, President Daniel Ortega has espoused a discourse of multicultural recognition and claimed that the FSLN government is committed to meaningfully addressing the land claims of Black and indigenous communities and restoring the multicultural rights that these communities fought for in the 1980s. Yet the state has committed no resources to protecting indigenous communities from colonos, investigating crimes against these communities, or prosecuting those responsible for threatening and killing indigenous activists in the region. Black communities in Bluefields, the capital of the South Caribbean Coast Autonomous Region where I work, and home to the nation's largest Afro-descendant population, have observed these developments with growing alarm. Black land rights activists allege that the state has tacitly and actively violated their territorial and collective cultural rights by refusing to address, let alone stop, the violent land grab unfolding in the region. They argue that the Ortega administration's implicit indifference to the theft of Afro-descendant and indigenous communal lands is part of a larger historical strategy by the Nicaraguan state to dispossess these communities and undermine their claims to territory and political recognition in order to advance a national project of economic growth through an extractivist development model that erodes the legal rights of Black and indigenous peoples. Quote, "It's a form of genocide," said Dolene Miller, who's an activist I've been working with for many years. End quote. Just like the Spaniards came to this land hundreds of years ago and committed genocide against the natives, mestizos are coming here and trying to get rid of us to colonize the land, end quote. In response to these colonial logics, over the last 20 years, Black activists and community members have begun to engage in more radical forms of political critique against the Nicaraguan state. In particular, they have begun to deploy the discourse of genocide and dispossession to describe their political relationship to the government. They argue that the experience of black citizenship in Nicaragua is defined by being marked as exploitable and disposable, and they identify the state's long policy of benign neglect, internal colonialism, extractive industrialization, and social exclusion as a strategy for producing black physical, material, and social death. They are clear that this is not simply a critique of a single administration. The excesses and violence of the authoritarian Sandinista party state represents, in their analysis, another temporal node in the longue durée of anti-black state formation and regional exclusion. This foundational anti-blackness is most clearly illustrated in the state's efforts, despite its rhetorical commitment to multicultural recognition, to undermine black and indigenous peoples' efforts to achieve meaningful self-government and to have a role in determining the political and economic conditions in which they live. Black activists have argued that the state has done this by disavowing the juridical norms and state policies that have made multiculturalism part of the state's discursive repertoire of governance. Rather, multiculturalism, defined as official recognition of cultural diversity within the mestizo nation state and the granting of a narrowly defined set of collective rights based on the performance of particular forms of cultural difference, like having your own indigenous languages, your own sort of cosmovision, spiritual traditions, customary law, etc. All of this has increasingly become the mechanism by which the state enacts black and indigenous dispossession. And so just for a bit of context, in 1987, the government of the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, or the FSLN, approved the Law 28, also called the Autonomy Law, and this was the first time that any Latin American state had ever done this, so it was actually, in juridical terms, kind of a watershed moment. So the Autonomy Law, which recognized Nicaragua as a multicultural nation state, ending nearly a decade of armed conflict with indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples on the Caribbean coast. The legislation's approval marked a critical turning point in the Nicaraguan state's relationship with Caribbean coastal communities. For the first time, the state acknowledged these communities' long-standing demands for collective land titling, regional autonomy, self-determination, and just economic development. Yet despite the state's adoption of a discourse of multicultural recognition, black communities on Nicaragua's Caribbean coast remain politically marginalized and increasingly impoverished as a result of neoliberal reforms implemented by conservative administrations following the end of the revolution in 1990, as well as the Sandinista government's own deepening authoritarian tenor. And so in the book, I'm really trying to make sense of, like, what does autonomy mean in a context of authoritarianism, and what does it mean when, when official multiculturalism, like, how do we make sense of the fact that black dispossession and exclusion continue to occur under a framework of kind of normative multiculturalism, that this is the state's own sort of frame for how it deals with and manages racial and cultural difference? How do we make sense of these continuing forms of exclusion? And how does this sort of speak to or highlight the limits of multicultural governance and recognition? And more importantly, what can the kind of forms of activism that black women are engaged in, how can that help us to think differently about how authoritarianism is playing out in these spaces and the kinds of political possibilities that might come into view if we engage with black women as serious political actors who have something important to offer us in terms of how to challenge state violence in these terms. So I want to tell you a little bit about Bluefields. So Bluefields is a small multicultural port city seated along the shores of the southeastern Caribbean coast of Nicaragua. The city faces east towards the sea, its back turned proudly to the Mestizo Pacific. It is the capital of the South Caribbean Coast Autonomous Region and home to the country's largest population of Afro-descendant Creole communities. Creoles are the maroon descendants of formerly enslaved Africans who fled the plantation societies of British colonies in the Caribbean and who intermarried with local European settlers and the indigenous peoples of the region, specifically the Miskitu, who lived there they've been there forever. Creoles have lived in Bluefields as well as in communities located north in the Pearl Lagoon Basin and further south in communities like Monkey Point and Greytown since the 17th century, when Dutch and British pirates began to use the region's complex interior river system as an important port for Europe's emerging global capitalist trade in the natural resources of the region and also in the marketing of rum and other kinds of contraband and enslaved Africans at this time. Bluefields is located in a region historically known as the Mosquitia. From the late 18th century until 1893, the Mosquitia, for all intents and purposes, operated as a semi-sovereign state whose political allegiance was not to Spain or Nicaragua, but to the British Empire. The informal alliances that the Miskito and Creoles brokered with Britons were formalized in the 18th century when Great Britain declared the region a British protectorate, a status that the area held for more than 200 years. Throughout this period, Bluefield's Creole communities were supplemented and transformed by subsequent waves of labor migration from the Anglophone Caribbean. As a result, these communities speak Mosquito Coast Creole, a regional English dialect that remains one of the most salient categories of Black cultural identity in Nicaragua, and which reflects the speaker's ancestral ties to the Caribbean, particularly the island of Jamaica. Throughout its history, the community has had a transnational character produced through circuits of labor migration and participation in hemispheric networks of politics, diplomacy, and commerce, particularly with port cities located along the coast of Central America, throughout the Caribbean, the United States, and Great Britain. The divergent and antagonistic colonial formations that produce the Pacific and the coast as conflictive political geographies have historically vexed Nicaraguan nationalist projects. In contrast to the multiracial political formation of the coast, Nicaraguan cultural and political elites have historically articulated a mestizo national identity, emphasizing the nation's origins in the colonial encounter between Spanish conquistadores and indigenous peoples in the Pacific, an articulation that tends to obscure the brutal violence of this historical encounter. This understanding of what constitutes Lo Nica is premised on an erasure of slavery and blackness in the Pacific and the participation of African and Afro-descended peoples in the construction of Nicaraguan nationhood. Although cultural elites began to tout mestizaje as a process of state formation by the end of the 19th century, mestizo nationalism was not consolidated for use as a discursive tool of Nicaraguan statecraft until the 1920s and 1930s. Cultural and political elites shaped popular as well as official narratives of racial difference and national identity in order to naturalize their own right to rule. Their discourse focused on establishing the identity of the nation and closely policing the boundaries of citizenship along racial lines. The Caribbean coast as a multiracial, multilingual enclave society with deep cultural, political, and economic ties to the larger Black Atlantic world posed a key threat to this race project of state formation. Indeed, state elites explicitly identified the region's Blackness and indigeneity as fundamental obstacles to the region's full integration and assimilation into the mestizo nation state, a narrative that has persisted well into the present, which you'll see in a moment. So, El Azote is a weekly supplement published each Sunday in the conservative national newspaper La Prensa. In 2003, El Azote, and the name El Azote in Spanish means the whip, so it's like a satirical political magazine that's quite merciless in its critique of contemporary Nicaraguan politics. So in 2003, El Azote published a map of Nicaragua according to political class. The political cartoon depicts a map of Nicaragua according to its political classes, illustrating the realpolitik of power, corruption, and the curious political alliances and concessions made throughout the 1990s and early 2000s between the leaders of the country's two most powerful political parties, the nominally leftist Sandinista National Liberation Front and the conservative Liberal Constitutional Party, or the PLC. The cartoon focuses largely on the Pacific region and features an image of a caudillo, or strongman figure, seated on a horse as he smiles and gestures at his poverty-stricken country. The area he occupies belongs entirely to the nation's land-rich elite that owns vast tracts of land in the Central Pacific region. A dilapidated house depicted alongside the man stands as a painful testament to the impoverished conditions under which the vast majority of the population lives, while the reader is informed about ongoing border conflicts with Costa Rica to the south and the ecological destruction of the region's major lakes and water sources. It is the representation of the Caribbean coast, however, that is, for me, most intriguing. In the image, the region is entirely separated from the rest of the country and marked with a large sign that warns the reader that the coast has been handed over to the international drug trade. The waters of the Caribbean are identified as Colombian waters, aguas colombianas, where traffickers travel freely. A light-skinned man, presumably Colombian, walks through the southern region of the coast, a gun raised in one hand and a suitcase overflowing with cash in the other. Like the tourist maps of the 1950s and 1960s, this political cartoon contains textual and visual markers. According to this map, the coast only produces three things: cocos, coca, y más coca. Coconuts, cocaine, and more cocaine. The most revealing statement, however, is the short description at the top of the separated coast, which marks it as una zona de negros, a black zone, a designation that seems particularly strange given the accelerated migration of landless mestizo farmers to the coast since the 1990s, which has made Afro-descendant peoples increasingly a minority in the region. Nevertheless, the characterization of the region as a lawless zona de negros continues to persist in the Nicaraguan spatial imagination. Thus, as the political cartoon aptly illustrates, the racialization of space in Nicaragua is not simply a matter of demarcating cultural, regional, and historical differences between the Pacific region and the coast, but essentially preoccupied with the containment of counternational blackness. The cumulative effect of these spatial representations is that they reproduce the idea of black communities as domestic other, while naturalizing the political and economic exclusion of these communities by depicting the region as a site of criminality and anarchy. This discursive representation illustrates, as Charles Mills argues, how racial states norm national space and citizens through a spatial tautology that naturalizes the characterization of racially subjugated groups as counternational subjects whose otherness is embedded in the landscapes that they inhabit. Thus, ontology and space become mutually constituted political categories that, quote, enact a circular indictment. You are what you are. This is now Charles Mills, not me. You are what you are in part because you originate from a certain kind of space, and that space has those properties in part because it is inhabited by creatures like yourself, end quote. This racial spatial common sense is not only articulated in political cartoons and state policy towards the coast, but is also reflected in general perceptions of the region by mestizos from the Pacific. In a 2005 study by the United Nations Development Program, researchers asked 900 mestizos from Nicaragua from the Pacific region, a simple question. What do you know about the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua? The answers were revealing. Approximately 35.1% held largely negative views of the region as a dangerous area with high levels of drug trafficking and drug abuse, delinquency, and violence, while another 7.7% focused on the region's extreme poverty, high unemployment, and economic underdevelopment. Importantly, the study also found that approximately 78% of respondents believe that the coast's primary importance to the nation lay in its significance as a site for natural resources, specifically water, lumber, seafood, gold, minerals, biodiversity, and potential oil reserves, and whose exploitation could improve the national economy. The study found that mestizos tended to imagine the coast as, quote, a promised land, and tierra de nadie, which is like a no man's land, like nobody lives there, an uninhabited territory, or as a repository of riches that belongs to the majority Nicaraguan society by, quote, and this was from the PNUD report, by, quote, manifest destiny and divine will, end quote. The perception that Black and indigenous communities lack the rational capacities to realize the region's economic potential persists and constitutes a central part of the governing logics that shape the state's approach to the management of multicultural citizenship rights, ostensibly designed to give these communities greater control over their lands and natural resources. So I'm going to transition now to sort of talking about the administration of Daniel Ortega and how Black communities have responded to the violence of that administration. In November of 2016, President Daniel Ortega, alongside his wife and vice presidential running mate, Rosario Murillo, yes, you heard right, won the national election, securing his third consecutive term in a contest that was characterized by historically high levels of voter abstention and widespread electoral fraud. As Kai Taylor notes, Ortega has been at the center of Nicaraguan politics for nearly 4 decades. He first came to prominence in 1979 as a leader in the Sandinista Revolution, which overthrew the dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza Garcia, ending the longest-running family dynasty in the hemisphere. Ortega later served as the president of Nicaragua from 1985 to 1990, when he lost in the national elections to the conservative opposition leader, Violeta Chamorro. The FSLN made political history when it quickly recognized the election results, marking the first peaceful transfer of power and the beginning of the democratic transition in Nicaraguan politics. As he ceded power to the Chamorro administration, however, Ortega vowed that the FSLN would continue to, quote, govern from below, end quote, in an attempt to continue the project of social transformation initiated under the Sandinista Revolution. Upon regaining the presidency in 2007, it quickly became clear that after 16 years, however, of governing from below, Ortega had no intention of being placed in that position again. Over the last decade, Ortega and Murillo have orchestrated a systematic effort to consolidate power into their hands. They have asserted control over all 4 government branches, including the executive branch, the National Assembly, the court system, and the Supreme Electoral Council. Thank you. They have used their influence in the National Assembly to pass laws granting the executive increased authority over the army and the police, and giving the president additional power to make judicial and civil service appointments and to overturn a 1995 provision that limited consecutive presidential terms. So now he can run for president indefinitely. In June 2013, the FSLN-dominated National Assembly approved Law 840, which granted a concession for the construction of an interoceanic canal to HKND, a Chinese company owned by an obscure billionaire named Wang Jing. The bill was introduced and passed in 3 days without public or legislative debate or any comprehensive study of its potential environmental impact. If completed, the canal, which is projected to be 3 times the size of the Panama Canal, would be the single largest mega infrastructure project in modern global history and would pose enormous environmental costs to the country. So at the time of this writing, no progress has been made on the canal. Ortega hasn't spoken about it in several years. It's looking very likely that it won't happen. But the law remains on the books, which is distressing because what it essentially does is it provided a mechanism for the state to legally seize property, compromises the state's sovereignty by granting a private multinational corporation free reign over the national territory and endangering the environmental well-being of the country, not to mention the ways that it has radically undermined Black and Indigenous communal land claims. For many domestic critics, history appears to be repeating itself. Once again, a single powerful family has positioned itself at the center of national politics and manipulated the country's political institutions to serve its own ends. Scholars and journalists have increasingly argued that the Ortega administration represents the return of dynastic family rule to Nicaraguan politics and a calculated dismantling of the nation's short-lived democratic experiment. Yet mestizo political commentators have largely not examined the racialized dimensions of the authoritarian turn under Daniel Ortega. In many ways, this is indicative of a much longer history among the mestizo intelligentsia of ignoring the centrality of race to modern Nicaraguan state formation and nation building. Indeed, mestizo scholars have often tended to treat the problems of the coast as parochial politics that are tangential to the broader challenge of building representative democracy, despite the fact that the region has historically provided the political and material staging ground for Nicaraguan state modernization and development agendas. Following the critique of, I have like 1 page left. Following the critiques of Black activists, I argue that since the end of the revolutionary period, the Nicaraguan state, including both neoconservative and free market liberal administrations, as well as the nominally leftist Sandinista administration, has enacted the long-standing historical project of Black death and dispossession through the practice of what I term multicultural dispossession. Multicultural dispossession describes the many ways in which state actors and institutions drain multiculturalism of its radical transformative potential by espousing the rhetoric of democratic recognition while simultaneously supporting illiberal practices and policies that undermine Black political demands and weaken the legal frameworks that provide the basis for their claims against the state. These forms of dispossession form the very heart of the state's genocidal assault on Afro-descendant communities. And they argue that this violence was not produced solely by the Ortega administration, but it is the product of the violent economic effects of multiple conservative administrations from the 1990s and early 2000s that have adopted neoliberal economic reforms that left Black and Indigenous communities increasingly impoverished and have hollowed out regional autonomy as a tool for Black political self-determination. So in summary, in my work, I argue that Black women are responding to contemporary state violence by engaging in a politics of what I term diasporic locality, which speaks to the ways that Black women engage in multi-scalar forms of struggle and advocacy that link local struggles at the regional level to broader racial justice movements currently unfolding throughout the Americas. So I'll stop there and I can answer any questions that people have afterwards. Thank you.